Hello everyone, welcome back to my ranking of analog horror, and honestly I don't really want to waste any time here as there's a lot of shows to cover here. But before getting into it, make sure if you haven't already to watch part 1 of this, as this is a direct continuation of that one and you may wonder if I reviewed something that you wanted to see in there. So please go check out part 1 if you haven't already. Okay, let's begin. Hey, so before getting to this one, make sure if you haven't already to like and subscribe. Okay, let's continue. For me personally, I think my thoughts in the series is quite interesting as I really don't know what to think about it fully. There are episodes of this that I think are really good, and while IP horror has become overwhelming as of recently, this one was a little bit ahead of that bell curve, but then some episodes of it definitely fall flat and don't really add much to the story, and that's fine in all honesty. It should definitely be pointed out, however, that unlike a lot of the other analog horrors, we know exactly how this one was made, that being by someone on an iPhone, which is a frankly quite impressive feat, especially considering the scale that the series is at now. So I was quite surprised to see the level of backlash this one had surrounding it, considering I've seen far worse stuff out there. But while trying to remain unbiased, I do admit that the series does have tons of flaws, as many portions of this have the same stretch out faces, somewhat amateur storytelling, and the tried and true question I've been asking for a while now: why are these on VHS tapes? The context around the presentation doesn't make much sense, but these are all smaller issues in the grand scheme of things. And unlike a lot of the other analog horror series that I have covered, this one actually has a plot that progresses with each scenario, helping us learn more and more about the monster, as well as making it so that there's actual progression. This might not sound like that low of a bar, but there are so many analog horrors that do not progress whatsoever. So despite all the flaws, I found myself enjoying this one quite a bit more than a lot of the other IP horror series out there. So since I think it's a bit above average, I give it a B tier. Now, one that has a bit worse of a reputation is, of course, creators' actions aside, while I dislike the series, I do think a bit of the hate towards it is a bit much. Yes, this series has tons of issues, and I really can't say I enjoyed my time watching Urbanspook. The pacing is off, the storytelling is dry and repetitive, the characters and world building are next to non-existence. But do I think it is the worst thing that's ever come out of analog horror? No, not even close. I have seen much worse stuff out there over the years, so while the shock horror may be a bit much in Urban's series, I really wouldn't say I thought it was truly disgusting to me personally. I do think he could have handled the shocking situations much better than he did, and personally, I do hope for the future that he learns to take more care when discussing such topics, but do I think that makes it the worst series ever? No. Like, come on. We are talking about the same subgenre that gave us the Spider-Man analog horror. There's much, and I mean much, worse stuff out there than Urbanspook. It's essentially just a bad creepypasta, and at least unlike a lot of the other series, it does keep improving. However, what I will not approve of is the creator's reaction to criticism. The criticism against him for his Twitter meltdown that he still continues to have is completely deserved. However, in all honesty, I think the backlash around his behavior is just as annoying, as they ignore everything that the series does right to focus on the things that happen at the very beginning of his series. There are moments of brilliance in this series, such as the phone call and the police scene in the latest one, so I really can't say I disliked everything about it like I can say about the F-tier analog horror series. But because of all the issues, I really can't give the series anything higher than a D. This one may shock people, I don't really know, but the next one probably won't, which is of course The Mandela Catalogue is like a lot of innovators of a subgenre. It's a very flawed series, there are multiple issues, but it had one thing that really set it apart from many of the other series out there. That of course being the fact that it had a clearly interesting and original idea with a competent storyteller behind it. But also, like a lot of genre innovators, it made a ton of copycats who tried too hard to replicate the success of what made the Mandela Catalogue just so interesting. And because of all the issues those brought, upon going back to the original innovator, people will try to blame it for all the issues of its predecessors, calling it cliche and poorly made. However, I think you really need to take the Mandela Catalogue in the context of when it was made. It was one of the first to do the PSA style that we all know with analog horror, as well as being the first to add the mimic trope that we all know from the subgenre. And while I dislike a lot of the copycats that came after, I really cannot find myself having a truly negative opinion on the original series, as it's clearly trying to do something different and innovate with each new episode. And while I think some episodes are definitely much stronger than others, and with a lot of the effects in the episodes coming across quite weak and the acting at times being quite dull, you can tell that Alex is still just experimenting and not all the experiments are going to work. And in all honesty, to take a series that is at the top of the subgenre and still try to experiment with it and not just sticking to a formula is quite commendable and makes me appreciate what the Mandela Catalogue is much more. And in all honesty, I still enjoy this series overall and find myself coming back to it much more than a lot of the other big series out there. So because of all that, even though it has tons of flaws, I still give it an A tier, but while this one is constantly innovating, the next one pushed the subgenre even further. Wow, what a series. I've been waiting to come back to this series for a while now after my original review of The Rolling Giant. With each upload, the series just gets more and more fascinating and honestly just shows the immense talent that Kane has. He seems to be the golden goose of a YouTube horror recently, as every single thing that he touches seems to be the gold standard. And it makes sense. The Oldest You has got to be one of the most interesting series on this entire tier list. Front to back, I was not bored whatsoever, and the fact that he did this entirely with Blender is just absolutely insane to me. Every appearance of the giant is genuinely starting and off-putting and really makes the series stand out in an interesting way. But I know some people might say that this isn't analog horror, and I somewhat agree with that sentiment. I think personally this is a bit closer to digital horror than anything else, as it's supposed to be a YouTube web series. But it was included in this tier list, so I decided to rank it. Don't blame me, blame the tier list creator. And it's quite impressive, as Kane was able to elevate the subgenre to new levels, and it really sets a high bar for what a series can and can't do. And in all honesty, I really can't see a series being any better than this one. It's an almost perfect series. Everything is good about it, down to even the soundtrack, which is just truly haunting. And the monster isn't just some mimic or superhero turned evil, which is just a breath of fresh air and makes it stand out within the sea of Mandela Catalogue clones. That's not to say there isn't poorly made or abundant clones of the oldest few. There are, but none are even worth really mentioning, and they just don't reach the same levels as the series whatsoever. And with my ability to not find too many issues within the series, I really can give this only one score, that of course being an S tier. This series is the gold standard. It really does not get much better than this, which is unfortunately the complete opposite of the next one, which is of course this one isn't really a specific series, rather just a group of analog horror shorts that become overwhelmingly common and everywhere. I've done a whole video on one of the most popular ones of this category, that of course being Anti-Piracy by Valix. Many of these are pretty cliche, taking a lot from creepypastas and popular horror stuff before them, and tons of them are extremely derivative. For example, the one I covered used the exact same scare from another horror game, that of course being No Players Online. Unfortunately for these videos, I just don't find the concept behind these very interesting or intriguing whatsoever. Many of these are extremely dull, not really adding anything meaningful or worthwhile to the subgenre as a whole. I mean seriously, what is even the point behind these? Half of these are ripped off scares or so derivative that the lack of originality is glaring. Many of them copy things from Herobrine but remove the majority of the aspects of the original story that actually worked, such as the stalking and watching aspects of it, while keeping the cliches and poor writing. It makes for an extremely confusing experience, as while they try super hard to catch you off guard and intrigued in what's going on, but have an extreme lack of semblance of a plot of any kind. The majority of them come down to what if a ghost haunted the spooky block game, and that's it. It has got to be one of the worst aspects of the analog horror subgenre, and I really can't say I enjoyed this wing of the subgenre at all. And because of it, I really can't give this wing anything higher than an F tier. I'm sure there's a good variant of this, but I really haven't seen any yet, and with each one of these, I really find my disdain towards them grow and grow. So that's why I gave the score that I gave it, but while I have a strong disdain for it that keeps growing each time I see one, the next one is doing the complete opposite for me. So many of you might have found my channel from this video, as it's one of the most infamous on the channel. That of course being my video on the boiled one and how I think it signifies the decline of analog horror. And while with a lot of my reviews I find myself thinking about the content a bit differently with time, for better or for worse, I find myself still agreeing with many of my opinions on that video, although I wouldn't exactly recommend the video due to my boring storytelling at the time. By the way, I've never really said anything about this on my channel, but I would really recommend avoiding anything on my channel made before the creepypastas that made us, as many of these videos are of a much lower quality to the point of being unwatchable. But back to the boiled one. While many people may point out that Dr. Nowhere is an extremely talented artist, I still think that his writing is fairly hollow and reads like a poor attempt at SCP, which the boiled one exemplifies to the greatest extent on the channel. The boiled one I think runs into some of the same issues that Urban's series runs into, which is a great style but an extreme lack of substance. It's just an SCP, nothing more. I find myself extremely disappointed every time I hear about his stuff, as you hear about how he's one of the best of the genre, but when watching it, it still exemplifies many of the issues that plague the genre more than ever. And it sucks because you can tell that there's extreme talent here, but it just feels squandered by the lack of an intriguing and comprehensive story. Not to mention that I think some of the visuals are quite bad, with the bedroom scene being one of the worst thing I'd seen in analog horror for quite a while. The text changing on the back wall was absolutely hilarious to me, so I really cannot give this series as much praise as you may have wanted, but for me personally, I really can't give it anything higher than a C tier. I think people overhype the shit out of this one, which is always so shocking to me due to the disdain people have towards Urbanspook, because this series has all of the same issues besides the shock horror aspect. But none of the issues of this one are to the same level as the next one, which is of course while looking through these, I think the Smile Tapes is probably my least favorite conceptually. I mean, the scare is quite literally just the Germa sus face. I mean, come on, you cannot tell me people find this scary in the slightest. But here's the thing about the Smile Tapes, despite its poor concept and completely unscary visuals, I find the writing to be done in a way that's still interesting. It almost seems to be the antithesis of Urbanspook, with great writing but a piss poor concept and horrible visuals. However, I think a lot of the backlash toward this one was also undeserved. Like, yes, it's another analog horror with stretched out faces, and the concept is pretty bad. But calling it the worst one out there is a bit of a stretch, and while I personally do not like it, I think harassing someone to the point of them completely deleting it is a bit much. I noticed that a lot with the ones on this. There's a ton on here that have been deleted due to the creators being harassed from the analog horror community, and that's quite disappointing to see. Same thing happened with the creator of Needle Mouse, and despite me not liking either one of these series, I think harassing the creators to the point of them trying to delete everything is extremely disappointing behavior. We need to encourage criticism, but encouraging someone to delete all their content is not going to help them get any better. That's just harassment. That does not help anyone get any better. But with all that being said, I still really can't say I was a fan of the Smile Tapes either, so in giving it a score, I still think it gets a D tier. I've seen much worse, of course, but calling this one good would also be a disservice, as in all honesty, it wasn't. In fact, it was quite bad. But with all that being said, make sure if you haven't already to like and subscribe, as well as comment which ones you think were good and which ones you think weren't. Make sure to let me know if you agree or disagree, and I'll see you all next week.